So it's 2024. We were last gathered here about 4 years ago, 2020. So do I look as young as I did 4 years ago? I hope so. Thank you. Appreciate that. It's great to have you back. We really wanted to move out of the Zoom world and back to face-to-face. So this is our first of 3 talks, and you're here at Yakima Valley College in our new conference center. And I just want to say, so I'm Matthew Lozier, I teach in biology, but the folks that are really doing work here, like Jacob here, Dustin in the back, a number of leaders at Yakima Valley College that said that they wanted to help support these talks and offer this space. So I'm really grateful to those people. And at this time, I'll turn it over to Cy Philbrick with the Cowiche Canyon Conservancy.
Thank you. Hi folks, my name is Cy Philbrick with CCC. I also just wanted to thank you all for coming. We really appreciate, speaking on behalf of both CCC and YVC, that so many folks turn out to live events. As Matthew said, it's been a while since we've done this, and it's just a pleasure to see that people come out and support the sciences and support learning in a public space. I think it's great. Yakima is clearly a geology town, which is very cool. Yeah, some people may not know that. Just a few housekeeping items before we get started here. Just a reminder to folks, we are recording this event live. It's the first ever time we've done that in partnership with YVC and CCC. It's being live streamed on YouTube. So please silence your phones or figure out a way to keep them quiet. And also, if you could, hold your questions until the end of the talk. We're going to save about 30 minutes for a question and response time. And I have a feeling there will be plenty of questions in this live audience. We're going to give preference to the live audience for questions. So when it's time for the Q&R, I'll run around with a mic and field questions from the audience. Yeah. The last announcement is we have 2 more talks in this series. So this is the Winter Talk series. We're getting a little bit of a late start. It's kind of the late Winter Talk series. This winter, we had a talk moved from January. We typically like to have a talk January, February, March. So now they're going to come quick and forcefully, February and March. So we have one in 2 weeks from a hyper-local speaker, Greg Mackey, who's with the WDFW, the Washington Department of Fish and Wildlife, who will be speaking about the natural history of elk and some of the problems and solutions to managing such a large and social and smart animal. And so that's in 2 weeks, right back here. And then March 12th, we have Tanya Cheek with Washington State University, who's going to be speaking about life below ground. So some of the microbiota that play a very increasingly important role, we're realizing, in the success of restoration. So things like fungi, bacteria, and other small organisms. So it's a little bit of cutting edge research, which I'm excited to hear. That's March 12th. But tonight, y'all are here for above ground things, one of the most exciting episodes in recent geologic history, the Ice Age floods. Our tour guide tonight is the one and only Bruce Bjornstad, who is joining us from the Tri-Cities. Bruce is a geologist and author, and it's your show, Bruce.
Test. Is that working? I've got to stand over here so I can advance the slides. Is that too loud? Not loud enough? Just right? Great. Thank you all for having me here tonight. Maybe a little background. I've been a geologist for 43 years now. And I grew up in New Hampshire, and I went to an undergraduate degree at University of New Hampshire. And is there feedback? I have to advance the slide, so.
I'm just gonna try to fix it.
Okay, maybe you can advance. Okay, is that better?
Yes.
Great. So, New Hampshire, I went to Oregon, Portland State University for a while, and when I went to graduate school up at Eastern Washington University. And that's where when I was up there, I learned about the floods. That was back in around 1978 when I started learning about the floods, and then I did my master's thesis on tushy beds, which are these slackwater flood deposits that were from glacial Lake Missoula. Slackwater beds that moved up the Walla Walla Valley and the Yakima Valley, created these beautiful rhythmically bedded sediments that and you can actually use those to count the number of floods that have taken place in the past. And the place I studied, we counted 40 separate floods, and that was only at the very end of the Ice Age. Now we know there were floods that go way back to 2 million years. Still hear me okay? Okay, all of a sudden it got softer. So not as much feedback. But anyway, we know the floods went back to about 2 million years to the beginning of the Ice Age, the Pleistocene. And we're starting to see, every year we learn more and more, and there are more people studying these things. So that would be the history of the floods has broadened significantly over the years. And who knows, in 10 or 20 years, we might know a lot more new things that we don't know right now. We're learning new things all the time. Anyway, I'm here to show you a photographic exploration of the floods. I have a drone that I've been flying for about 10 years, several different drones. And so I've taken a lot of pictures from the air and from fixed wing airplanes. I've also gotten a lot of pictures from the air, from airplanes. So I'm going to share with you tonight a lot of these pictures that I've taken from the air. And the scale of the floods was so huge that you really can't see the evidence or appreciate the magnitude of the floods until you get way up high and you can see the big picture. So that's what I'm here to do tonight, is to show you the big picture and how tremendous and huge these floods really were. So we'll start out here. This is Dry Falls and the Grand Coulee. A lot of you, how many people have been to Dry Falls Visitor Center? Probably most of you. When you went there, you drove along Highway 17, which is this road over here. There's the visitor center right there. These falls, there's actually two cataracts with a blade of rock down the middle. That's typical characteristic of these floods, is they have these cataracts with a blade of basalt down separating the two. But the floods didn't just go over these cataracts. Everything you see in this picture, except for way over here in the upper right, was all under hundreds of feet of flood water at the same time. And there were dozens of coulees like this in the Scabland. So you can imagine how much water it would take to fill the surface with hundreds of feet of flood water and then go for another 100 miles to the east of here. There were more of these cataracts all through the Scabland. So there are actually three sources, at least three sources of floodwaters in the Pacific Northwest. The one that we're most familiar with is glacial Lake Missoula, which is up here in the upper right. But there was also at least one flood, well, there was one flood that we know of that came from Lake Bonneville down in Utah, and it went down the Snake River, and eventually it got into the Columbia River Gorge and out to the Pacific Ocean going this way. And there's a third source of water. We know there was at least one flood from Lake Columbia, which is up here, north of Grand Coulee in the Columbia River Valley. And so we know there's one flood here, one flood from here, but we know there are at least 40 floods, and probably many, many more than that from glacial Lake Missoula. And more recently, there's been more talk about floodwater actually coming down from underneath the ice from Canada, from British Columbia. So there could be a fourth source of water that's coming in from the ice sheet itself. You're zooming in now. I'm going to focus mainly on glacial Lake Missoula because that's where we have the most evidence for the Missoula floods, more than any others. And plus it occurred, dozens of times, whereas the other floods weren't as frequent. The Lake Missoula is over here in Montana. It's on the west side of the Continental Divide. And there are these fingers of ice that came down from Canada, from British Columbia, blocked the Clark Fork River by the Purcell Trench load, came down and it blocked the Clark Fork River, creating this huge lake, 500 cubic miles of water in glacial Lake Missoula. And that ice dam held for about 40 to 80 years, something like in that range, before there was so much water backing up behind the ice dam that it was actually worked its way under the ice, or actually fractured through the ice itself. But we don't know exactly how it failed, but we know it had to have failed because all that water drained out in a matter of just a few days or less. 500 cubic miles of water. And it was confined to a narrow river channel, the Clark Fork River, so the water couldn't go anywhere else but down the ancient river channel, the Clark Fork River channel, down into the area of Spokane, which is up here. And a lot of that Lake Missoula floodwater encountered another lake, glacial Lake Columbia, which was formed behind this other ice dam, the Okanagan low. So all that water from Lake Missoula was forced and spread out across what we call the channel scabland of eastern Washington. So you can imagine this happened at least 40 or more times. There were other times when the Okanagan lobe hadn't advanced far south enough to block the Columbia River, and when that happened, any floods from Lake Missoula would simply go down the Columbia River all the way down into the Tri-Cities area and through Willilla Gap. The only way out for the floodwaters eventually was through Willilla Gap, which is down here. It's a narrow gap that's only about 2 miles wide. You can imagine when all that water converged on just a tiny opening, the water had to back up. It had no other place to go. So it created a big lake that we call Big Lake Lewis down here in the Tri-Cities. Where we are here in Yakima, up here, we were under floodwaters here. I think maybe 100 or 200 feet of floodwater, but it didn't go up much farther. It back flooded up the Yakima River up to 1,200 feet elevation. And that would have taken it up to about as far as just north of Yakima here. The water also backed up the Walla Walla Valley. You see these lighter brown areas are places, those were slack water areas where the floodwaters slowed way down because they went up these back flooded valleys. Another back flooded area was the Snake River. Floodwaters from Lake Missoula went all the way up the Snake to about Lewiston and even beyond up into the Hills Canyon area. So anyway, that's kind of a rough sketch. I'm going to zoom in and focus on some of these areas in more detail during the rest of the talk. There's where the ice dam was, up there, and then when that ice dam failed, all that water from Lake Missoula drained out in a matter of 3 days or less, hit Lake Columbia, and then it spread out across the scabland. There was a steep gradient to the land surface through the channel scabland, so it did a lot more erosion. The channel scabland is these very chaotic mazes of basalt rock and streamlined loose hills at a very steep gradient. So the floodwaters went very fast through this area, and then they slowed way down when they got down here because the water had backed up behind the little gap, and any more water coming down would have just made that lake deeper and extend the water up into these tributary valleys. So the last flood we know of from Lake Missoula was about 15,000 years ago, and the earliest flood could have been 1 to 2 million years ago. We don't know if that earliest flood or earliest floods from Lake Missoula or from some other source, even coming down from underneath the ice in Canada. The Ice Age floods were also the brainchild of this individual, J. Harlan Bretz, who really spent most of his life studying the floods. And he'd come out to, he was actually in the Midwest, in Michigan, Illinois, doing his graduate work. But every summer he'd come out here and spend all summer just driving around, walking and hiking around the Channel Scabland to look for the evidence, to explain the unusual landforms that he was seeing. He saw things that he had never seen before. And he was very curious, and he came out and he started studying these things back in, starting in around the early 1920s, 1921, I think, was when he first came out here. He spent a couple of years driving and hiking around, and after that 1 or 2 years he was here, he could only come up with one explanation, and that was the only genetic interpretation yet proposed, which is inherently harmonious and fits all the known data, is that of a great flood of water. And he proposed this in 1923, almost 100, just over 100 years ago. And he got, from then on, his hypothesis was considered outrageous. All the other geologists didn't agree with him because they thought the Earth's crust, the land surface changed very slowly over long periods of time, like a river's carved channels and coulees and canyons. But here Bretz was proposing something that was very outrageous and unusual and occurred very quickly over a short period of time. And this didn't sit well with the other geologists at the time. But in 1923, in one of his first years here, he spent all summer or all season hiking around eastern Washington through the Channel Scabland, and he mapped what he thought were channels of the Missoula. He didn't know about the Missoula flood. He just knew there was a lot of water coming from somewhere. It was coming from the direct direction of Spokane, so he called it the Spokane flood. And he thought there was only one. Turns out there were dozens, but this is what he did. He was able to do this in 1923. He never got off the ground to do this. He was out, he did it just by driving and hiking around. He put together this map, a very detailed map showing you where the erosion took place and the deposition, flood bars, giant car ripples, things like that. So this is a satellite photo showing you the same thing. And here, he was able to recreate what we can clearly see on the satellite photo. We can see the channels. These are places where the floods removed all the topsoil, or what we call polluous loess, wind-blown silt. Covers this whole area, but when the floods came through, they eroded through that wind-blown silt, the polluous, down to the bare basalt bedrock, which is black basalt. So in satellite, the channels show up very nicely on this satellite photo. But Bretz was able to do the same thing from the ground in a matter of a year or two. So now we're going to zoom in on the ice dam for glacial Lake Missoula. Lake Missoula is over here. It extends on quite a ways to the east from here. And I'm showing you where the ice dam was here. And these are the lobes of ice coming down from British Columbia. The Purcell Trench lobe came down went over Sand Point, and it continued all the way down to the lower end of Lake Ponderay, northeast of Spokane. But another finger of ice actually went up the Clark Fork River. It went against the flow of the river. The ice actually moved up about 20 miles east of Lake Ponderay, and that's where the ice dam was. It was right at the Idaho-Montana border. And that ice dam was probably about 3,000 feet thick at that point. The Lake Missoula was about 2,000 feet deep, pushing against the ice dam here. Clark Fork River drains in this direction here. And so the ice was blocking the Clark Fork River. There was no place else for the water to go. So it backed up, created this huge glacial Lake Missoula. So now I'm gonna, we'll zoom in now on the upper end of the ice dam, or the lower end of glacial Lake Missoula, the upper end of the ice dam. So now we're looking west. This is looking west towards the ice dam that was coming up the Clark Fork River. This is a real image, except for the ice, and all the icebergs were drawn in digitally. So this is a recreation done by Dave Bennett of what Lake Missoula probably looked like. Lake Missoula never went up. It never got deep enough to flow over the top of the ice. But it did back up 2,000 feet deep. So in this area here, the lake was 2,000 feet deep against 3,000 foot thick ice dam. So how do we know there was a Lake Missoula? It's obviously not there today. The best piece of evidence, there's a couple good pieces of evidence for Lake Missoula. One is these strand lines. Okay, these are ancient lake levels of Lake Missoula, and they're very parallel, and they kind of follow the same. They line up with the same elevation, all the way up to about 4,200 feet elevation, and then they stop. Okay. That tells us these are ancient lake levels of Lake Missoula that got up to 4,200 feet deep, or 4,200 feet elevation. And that's as high as the lake got. If the lake had gotten deeper, it would have gone all the way up to the top of Mount Jumbo, but that's where it stopped. I've actually hiked up this area, and I can vouch for the fact that the strand lines go up to one point, and then they stop automatically. So we have a 3,000 foot deep ice or lake, glacial Lake Missoula, pushing against the ice dam. And when the ice dam finally breaks and there's a flood from Lake Missoula, the water all of a sudden drops. It drains, I think it drains in 3 days or less. All that water, 500 cubic miles, is gone in 3 days. So all that water, when the ice dam was gone, that water just rushed out very quickly. And when the lake encountered passes like this in the lake, the water would speed up through those passes and actually create scabland. It carved out scabland up here at Markle Pass, and it deposited a flood bar on the downstream end of the scabland that it carved out up here. And then there are also these giant current ripples. Okay, these were created by the rushing water moving at a very high clip, creating these giant current ripples. And here are two more examples. This is Wills Creek Pass, which is near Markle Pass. Here's another place where the lake was rushing through a narrow opening in the lake, and that created scabland, and then downstream it deposited flood gravels that are bigger than the size of this podium, were transported by the water. That's not just a trickle of water. It takes a lot of water to move, something this size. And you can see the ripples are always steeper on the downstream side than the upstream side. So we can tell the direction of flow of the water by the asymmetry in these ripples. And they were definitely flowing heading west towards the outlet for Lake Missoula. All right, so we're moving down a little further downstream for the floods. Here's the ice. This is the lower end of the ice dam that was removed during these Ice Age floods. So when the floods came through, it took out all this ice all the way up to the area that I showed earlier. And with that ice gone, all that water drained down through this narrow opening, the Clark Fork River, into the Pend Oreille Basin, and then spread out, heading towards the scabland of eastern Washington. There's a little bit of water that actually spilled out through a place called Blanchard Channel, the Hoodoo Channel, that went up through Newport, that went up in a different direction, but ended up in Spokane also. But all the water ended up going through Spokane, and most of it coming down through the Rathburn Prairie, as we see here. We have these lakes all around the margins of Rathburn Prairie. And those are there because Rathburn Prairie used to be a normal stream valley, river valley. The floods, older floods deposited and filled up Rathburn Prairie. They raised the level of the Rathburn Prairie. So what it did is it blocked the streams coming in from the sides. So those are natural lakes that formed as the Rathburn Prairie was raised up, that ended up blocking that drainage water coming out. And here's kind of an inset showing you, and this is I'm zooming in. These photos now are looking kind of in this direction here. You can see when the ice was there, it got down to about as far as Bayview, at the upper end of Rathburn Prairie. That's about as far as the ice got. This is what it looks like today. This is Lake Pend Oreille. Lake Pend Oreille was all filled with ice during the Ice Age. So floods coming down from Rathburn Prairie into Spokane, down into the Spokane Valley, and into the Columbia River, eventually up here. But when there was ice blocking, coming down from the north and blocking these rivers, all that water from Lake Missoula it would hit the Columbia Lobe and it would get diverted out. There would have been a big lake called Lake Columbia in this area, or Lake Spokane. Yeah, with that lake full of water behind the Columbia Lobe, all the water from Lake Missoula would have been forced to go out across the channel scabland. This is the Cheney-Palouse scabland tract over here. This is called the Telford Crab Creek tract. So any water coming in and there being a Columbia Lobe in place would have forced all the water out across into the channel scabland. At other times, the Columbia Lobe wasn't there. It was somewhere up to the north, and it wasn't blocking the river. And then Missoula floodwaters could go down and hit Lake Columbia and then drain out anywhere along through here. And at times when the Okanagan Lobe hadn't advanced as far, it would actually go down all the way to Grand Coulee, and it carved. That's how it carved out the Grand Coulee. Was when the Okanagan Lobe was in the way of any floodwaters from Lake Missoula. So floodwaters were forced to go along the edge of the ice sheet, and that's how Grand Coulee got rained out. This is what it looks like without the ice dam. Now we did have floods coming down from Lake Missoula also when there were no ice dams blocking the Columbia River. There were probably ice coming down, but it was north of the Columbia River. So anytime we had floods at that time, the floods from Lake Missoula would just go all the way down the Columbia River, all the way around. And we do have evidence for floods, big floods, going down the Columbia River at a time when the ice wasn't being blocked by the Okanagan Lobe. I love the satellite photos because you could really see the edge of the Okanagan Lobe. See that change in that arcuate shape here? That's the edge of the Okanagan Lobe, and you can actually see it on these satellite photos. That's the maximum extent of the Okanagan lobe. But at other times, during the Ice Age, that Okanagan lobe could have been anywhere up in this area up here as well. This is just the maximum extent. At other times, it was at different positions. Oops. I hit the wrong button. There we go. Okay, so we have some very diagnostic features that you can use to distinguish or identify these Ice Age floods. And I group them into two groups, erosional and depositional. Okay, erosional features are ones that form from the erosion, the eroding away of rock and soil, the blue soil and rock, created some very, a long list of these diagnostic features. And we have depositional features that form from the accumulation of sediment that was transported by the floods. And that includes, these giant flood bars where the floodwaters slow down temporarily, creating these huge accumulations of sand and gravel, giant current ripples that I showed you already, examples up in Lake Missoula, slackwater rhythmites that I'll point out later, and we have these ice-rafted erratics. Erratics are rocks or big boulders of rock that don't belong. They're practically all the channel scatland and most of the areas drained by the floods in Washington are underlain by Columbia River salt. That's our main rock here, as well as here in Yakima. But when you see a piece of granite diorite sitting out hundreds of feet above the valley floor, that's what we call an erratic. Okay? It's a rock that doesn't belong, and it can be traced back to someplace else. And and Brett's and others right away identified these erratics all over eastern Washington. And I'll be showing you a bunch of pictures of those. But before we do that, the Palouse Hills played an important role in the Ice Age floods that went through the Channel Scabland. Okay, the Channel Scabland now has all these dark basaltic channels with intervening places where they do agriculture, where they grow crops. And those places where they grow crops is usually the Palouse. These are Palouse Hills, rolling Palouse Hills of wind-blown silt that have been accumulated over about 2 million years. And here is an example of what the loss looks like for the Palouse Hills, or by loss I mean wind-blown silt. This is what it looks like in eastern Washington, where it hasn't been flooded. They're just these beautiful rolling hills of very evenly textured wind-blown soil. So that's not flooded. Now where it is flooded, you see stuff like this. At one time there used to be Palouse soil like we just saw all over this area. But when the floods came through, they eroded channels and streamlined these Palouse hills that you can see here. They're usually steeper on the upstream end and gentler on the downstream end. So these are streamlined Palouse islands created by Ice Age floods that were going through. They may have gone up and over the tops of these islands, but they may have just gone up out along the flanks of these islands here. And they did more erosion in the center of the channel than they did on the sides, leaving behind these remnants of Palouse. So here's an example of just one island. It was a bigger island, and it was actually dissected. You can see where the floods eroded the channel going across. This is all basalt out here. And again, this whole area was all covered with this beautiful green, lush vegetation before the floods. But after the floods, you can see how the floods eroded down to the basalt bedrock, and then they started eroding laterally into the Palouse Hills, including this cross channel You can see here. Here's a beautiful example of a loess island. They're usually steep and pointed at the upper end, the front end up here. And with all three of these, the floods are going from bottom left to upper right. So they cut a very steep prow to these islands, and then they taper off at the downstream end. Here's one looking upstream. You can see these are the prows. Floods were coming from the upper left and going down in this direction. And they eroded channels. You can see how they eroded down into the basalt and started eroding into the basalt as well. You can see it in several different layers of basalt exposed along this channel here. But they did leave behind remnants of the plumes as well. Okay, potholes are another characteristic of these ice age floods. You know, we see potholes in, where I grew up in New Hampshire, we used to see potholes about like this from glaciers, melting glaciers in the White Mountains. There's my friend Tom. This thing it's huge. I mean, they're huge. And they're formed by colks. Colk is a circulating eddy in the water, okay? So we think the floods, for some reason, there was probably a lot of turbulence as the floods were moving along. And in places you start getting these turbulent eddies forming. And we think that's what drilled out these holes. And if there are rocks down at the bottom, the floods may have used those rocks to help deepen and widen these potholes. But there's three examples of potholes. You know, a lot of times you won't see them on the ground until you're right up next to them. So they're really best looked at, studied from above, from up high. Rock blades are another characteristic of these ice age floods. Rock blades, or basalt, all the blades, rock blades and the channel scatland are basalt. And basalt is highly fractured, so it's easy for floods to actually pick up, to rip away columns of basalt and transport them with the water. And that's why we have such steep canyon walls and rock blades like you see here. This is a place called the Great Blade. This is Lake Lenore along the lower Grand Coulee. How many people have been up to Dry Falls in the upper Grand Coulee? You've driven by this, I'm sure. Coming up from Salt Lake, Highway 17, you go right by this thing. All you see a wall of basalt, but you don't know that it's only 10 or 20 feet wide. You think it's a massive wall of rock, and it's not. It's just a narrow blade of basalt. And we see that over and over again. Potholes Coulee, there's another blade, rock blade. And another characteristic of these coulees is a lot of times we'll see a rock blade and then a cataract on both sides. And we see that in Potholes Coulee. Here's one cataract, here's another with a rock blade running down the middle. Somehow when the floods were flowing through this area, the energy probably separated somehow, or there may have been vortices that were moving down, and they separately eroded out the separate canyons with a blade of basalt down the middle. That's one hypothesis. But we see that over and over again. Dry Falls, there's Umatilla Rock. Blade of basalt with a cataract on both sides. And again, Frenchman Coulee. There's the blade, basalt. This is actually Frenchman Coulee. This is called Echo Basin. It's another cataract, recessional cataract. It didn't go quite as didn't go upstream as far as the main Frenchman Coulee here. Okay, so now we've looked at erosional features. We're going to look at some depositional features for the accumulation of soil and rock sand and gravel. This is a Washtecna coulee, and along the sides of Washtecna coulee, you'll see a lot of these beautiful flood bars that have giant current ripples. These are ripples also, similar to what we see up in the Lake Missoula area that I showed earlier. But these are depositional in that they're composed of accumulations of sand and gravel mostly. And that's in this borrow pit, you can get a close-up look at what the sediment looks like inside that bar that has the ripples. There are, you can see there's some foreset bedding. This is mostly sand and gravel. If you walked up next to it, you'd be able to pull it apart with your hands. It's very crumbly and easily broken apart. Mostly sand and gravel. The lighter materials are usually mostly sand and silt. The darker layers are gravel and coarse sand. Very angular basaltic material. It's characteristic of these flood deposits. And you also have some foreset bedding. You can see that you have these layers dip in this direction there. And these actually are dipping downstream. And these are what we call foreset beds. So as the ripples were migrating along, those ripples were migrating. They were depositing these foreset beds as they moved downstream. And then we do have some upstream. Here's some examples of some upstream dipping here. This is an example probably of an eddy bar. So the water that created these ripples is actually eddying, circulating around back and reversing the apparent direction of the water flow. And it's mostly flowing downstream, which was to the west. More giant coral ripples. This is on a place called Odessa along the Crab Creek coulee. These are actually, I think these were taken around the same time, near the same location, but in two different seasons. But you can see clearly that they're asymmetric. The darker side is steeper on the downstream side. It's gentler on the upstream side. That tells you the water's going from right to left in these photos. You can tell the flow direction based on the shape of the ripples. And here's another example, Sprague Lake. Anybody been to Sprague Lake? If you go on I-84, no, I-90, that's I-90 to Spokane, you drive right by Sprague Lake, and this bar is this just looks like a low pile of dirt off in the distance, but it actually has ripples on it. You see them here. And here's another more ripples at Wilson Creek. But this is also along the lower Crab Creek over here. That's Crab Creek flowing through there. There's ripples going. They're actually at multiple levels, so they may have been forming at different times from different floods. And ice rafted erratics. These are depositional also. Okay, so here's a good example. This is a big boulder in Badger Coulee, near where I live in the Tri-Cities. This is a photographer from National Geographic that took it out on a tour once to get photographs of these. This one's a granodiorite. 3/4 of all the, I did a study at Rattlesnake Mountain near where I live in Tri-Cities, and I mapped over 2,000 erratics that were bigger than about a square foot, cubic foot. It's been several years doing that, and I located them on a map on Rattlesnake. And 3/4 of them are granodiorite or granitic rocks, which is, those are fairly common. They're not common here in the Scabland, but they are common, up in Canada and upstream, into Montana. So that must be, and they're fairly resistant to erosion. But we also do have a few, maybe 10% of rocks, erratics, that are made out of argillite. Okay, you can see that it's a banded argillite. It's a very hard, dense rock. You hit it with a hammer, it rings. It's so hard. And we could trace this back up to northern Idaho or Montana. So there's no argillite anywhere around here, and this is hundreds of miles away from the closest argillite. So, and it's also a few hundred feet, several hundred feet above the Columbia River. So and it's angular. That all points to the fact that it's an erratic. It has to be. This is the biggest one I've ever seen. And I've seen the most erratics in the Pasco Basin, Rattlesnake Mountain area where I live. But this one is actually up in the Scabland along Cow Creek Coulee. And it's 350 tons. This is the landowner that took me there, showed it to me. I couldn't believe it. It's a granodiorite, like most of them, but it's huge. But it's a fairly gentle, low relief area up there. So I think the floodwaters that were coming through probably weren't going down a river canyon or a coulee. They were spreading out across a broad, flat area. And I think that the water got, the depth of the water thinned as it spread out into that area. And I think because of the size of this, it takes a chunk of ice 10 times the size of a erratic to float it. So imagine this boulder in an iceberg 10 times that size, carrying it. It probably got grounded very quickly in this area, and it never made it any further. And subsequent floods weren't able to move it either because it's so huge. And here's one on the Little Gap, also granodiorite. So this boulder here is like, I think it's 700 feet above the Columbia River down here. This is a Little Gap down here, and it's angular again. Angular boulder up high. That's your sign that it has to be an erratic. Has anybody in here ever seen erratics? Have them in your property? Most everybody's probably seen them. You can also get things like that transported by glacier ice directly. But we know the ice never got down this far. It was hundreds of miles. Well, the front of the ice was 100 miles or 200 miles north of here, so there's no way these could have been carried down by the glacier itself. It must have been ice rafted. Okay, so I've introduced you to a lot of different new features, or characteristic features of the floods. Now I want to take you to some special places. I could talk about this for hours, but I've limited it to like 4 or 5 special places that I think are really cool, and I thought I wanted to share with you. So let's start out. Grand Coulee, that's a big one. I mean, that's a destination for most people that come just to look at the floods, evidence for floods. Grand Coulee is special. There's a Steamboat Rock out in the middle of Banks Lake. Banks Lake is a man-made reservoir, but before the 1950s, there was no lake there. There were a couple little small ponds. There are a couple little ponds. There's a big lake there, and I'll call it Banks Lake for irrigation. And this is looking the lower Grand Coulee, looking down on, there's the Coulee monocline, which is a place where the basalt flows have been actually tilted over on one side. And the road, the Coulee, actually runs up the middle of that monocline. The Great Blade, I showed you that earlier, remember? This is what it looks like from down below. This thing is only like 10 or 20 feet wide on top. But it looks like it's a massive wall of basalt that goes forever, but it doesn't. And then there's Dry Falls. These are both pictures looking in different directions. You can see there's the dual cataract canyon. There's actually a third cataract that started to form here. You got Umatilla Rock blade running down the middle. And then these grooves. These are erosional grooves that were created by the floods. Probably the hydraulics of the floods were so great, the power, I don't think it was other rocks or necessarily creating the grooves. I think it was the water itself, the cavitation taking place within the water as it was moving 50, 60 miles an hour, 300 feet deep, running through over the surface is what created these unusual grooves. Okay, Drumheller Channels. Anybody here have been there, know where that is? Drumheller Channels? A few of you? Up until 10 or 15 years ago, nobody knew where it was, but it's becoming more and more popular nowadays, mainly because of its basalt column. It has the best basalt columns you'll see anywhere worldwide. But it's north of Tri-Cities. It's south of Grand Coulee. This water here is coming out of Grand Coulee. And as it came out of Grand Coulee, it headed south. It also went west over Potholes Coulee and Frenchman Coulee, created these cataracts off the west side of the Quincy Basin. But most of the water was coming down through Quincy Basin, was forced to go through the Drumheller Channels. Everything in white was above the level of the floods. Okay, so anything, you can see how the waters, well, they couldn't go over these hills or these white areas, so they were forced to go through these low areas on the Drumheller Channels. So that's what I'm going to show you and focus on now. There's a closer up view of Drumheller Channels. Frenchman Hills were too high. The areas off to the east were too high. So you can see that it created a very chaotic mix and channels, coulees, potholes, and beautiful erosion of all of the salt columns in this area. And also, the Columbia River used to go through here. When the losing my light here. You can see the Okanagan lobe up there on the top. When that was in place, blocking the Columbia River to the east, there was a lake called Glacial Lake Missoula that developed behind that. That's also where the Columbia River flowed. And the Columbia River had to flow down along the east side of the Okanagan lobe, down ran through Grand Coulee, and all the way down to the Drumheller Channel. So from the Columbia River used to flow through the Drumheller Channels also, and then it rejoined the Columbia River down here. When the Okanagan lobe went back north, it melted back or eroded back north. Then the Columbia River took its normal, it went back to its normal route, was to go around the horn of the Columbia. So here's some of those channels and coulees and columns. So look at these beautiful polygonal columns. Most of them are 5- and 6-sided columns. Those are cooling. That's a cooling phenomenon that occurred as the basalt was cooling. As it condensed, it would actually form these 4-, 5-, and 6-sided columns. This picture here was basically taking a close-up of this area here. You see, this is a streamlined basalt island. Notice how it's pointed in the upstream end, tapered off on the downstream end. So we had loose islands that were streamlined by floods, but we also had basalt islands streamlined. And here's a cross channel created by the floods going across the top. The reason you don't see the columns all the way across this island is because it's covered by the entablature, which is the upper part of the lava flow. It's covering these columns. But when the floods came through, they eroded away the entablature, exposing the columns, which we see below. Okay, Lewis River Canyon is another unique spot. The yellow arrow points to a spot where the Palouse River used to flow and continued west into a place called Washtucknacoolie. But during the Ice Age floods, at some point during the Ice Age floods, during the last period of flooding or some previous period of flooding, the floodwaters flowing straight for the Snake River cut a new channel for the Palouse River. So it diverted the Palouse River out of the Washtucknacoolie and created a new channel down to the Snake River going this way. And it followed a very straight path because it was following a tectonic fracture in the rock. These rocks, you'll see this in some of the pictures that are coming up. You can actually see these distinct patterns of fracturing that went on, that the floods took advantage of. And so you see some of these linear features. You can see how straight it is here. This is looking downstream. This is looking upstream. So this point here is up here. These two. And in between, the floods not only flooded the canyon, they spilled over for hundreds of feet and eroded all the rock for miles on either side of the coulee, or the canyon. So here's the Palouse River here. You can see these other channels over here don't have water in them. There's a little pond here, but there's no through-going water stream in most of these places. The only place there's water flowing is down the Palouse. This area was all inundated by hundreds of feet of floodwater that eroded out these, preferentially along these tectonic fractures in the bedrock. Devil's Canyon. Anybody? How many people have been there? No, just a handful. And that's not surprising because there was no sign how to get there. And even people that want to go there sometimes never find it. How many people, if you go to Colotis, I'll tell you, if you go to Colotis, it's within a mile of Colotis. You come to the entrance, the upper end of Devil's Canyon. There's no water in it whatsoever today, no water. And there hasn't been for 15,000 years since the last flood. You see how dry it is. There's a road that goes all the way down, goes the whole length of it. It's beautiful. It's a real, it's a very special place. And I'm surprised the locals and the highway department haven't identified it somehow. But right now you can drive this road and you won't see another person driving up or down. You'll be the only one in there. There's some beautiful exposures of exposed Columbia River basalt. This happens to be the Pomona flow. See the beautiful fractured pattern in it. That's about 12 million years old. Okay, so far we talked about Missoula floods up until now, but I want to take this one slide and tell you some evidence for at least one flood coming down the glacial Lake Columbia, down the Columbia River at West Bar. And some of the best giant current ripples you see anywhere are at West Bar. If you're driving towards Wenatchee from Tri-Cities, or any place from Vantage. Yeah, from Vantage up north towards Quincy in that area. You'll drive along the east side of the river, and there's one place near Trinidad where you can look over and actually see these things from the road, from the highway. But there are some hikes where you can hike out onto Babcock Bench, which is that bench in the upper left of the lower image, where you can actually hike out to it and get a beautiful view of these giant current ripples. Some of the best ripples anywhere in the skyline. And the picture in the lower right is LiDAR. It's a special technique for really bringing out geomorphic features like these giant current ripples. Okay, so we're pretty much done talking about the scabland. Now we're gonna go downstream to the area of Wallula Gap, which is where all the water was forced to squeeze down through this little one little opening. It's about less than 2 miles wide. Created a big lake, went up to 1,200 feet elevation. It's called Lake Lewis. Down there, everything in blue would have been underwater. The deeper the blue, the deeper the water. The lighter the blue, the higher the water, or depth of the water. You can see how it did flood all the way up to Yakima up here. But by the time it had to go upstream, and the Yakima and the Walla Walla Valley were dead-end valleys. So once the floodwaters went up into these areas, they had nowhere else to go but just sit there. So the floodwaters slowed way down in these basins, the Walla Walla and Yakima. That's why we see a lot of these rhythmites, slackwater beds of sand and silt, fine sand and silt. They get preserved because the velocity and strength of the floods slowed way down and allowed these deposition. And that's why they're such good for agriculture too, because there's a lot of silt deposited, which is great for growing crops in the Yakima and the Walla Walla valleys. So these are some of those rhythmites I was telling you about. Burlingame Canyon in the Walla Walla Valley. I took this picture. I did my master's thesis. This was one of my study areas on 40 separate rhythmites. And we think each one of those represents a separate flood from Lake Missoula. And we say that because on one bed, at least one bed, there's a layer of pure volcanic ash on top of the bed. The other beds have evidence for burrowing animals, or plant roots going down, and the upper bed not having any. Starting at the top of the bed, that's an indication there's a period of time in between floods. So here at Burlingame, we know there's 40 of these separate rhythmites. And there's something similar in the Yakima Valley over by Granger. There's a beautiful exposure of similar rhythmites on the south side of what's the name of that island out there? It's out in the middle of the Yakima Valley. It's this thing here, Snipes Mountain. On the southwest side of Snipes Mountain, there's a good exposure of these rhythmites like this. And then there are a lot of icebergs floating around in that water. And most of the icebergs ended up along the margins of the Pasco Basin, over by Rattlesnake Mountain. There are quite a few up in the Yakima Valley and the Walla Walla Valley. Those are areas where the water slowed down and allowed these icebergs to migrate to these slower waters. So there's an image done by Stevominski based on a photo that I gave him of this area. We flew an airplane over here and got the photos. And he recreated where the water level you see here has a lot of icebergs in it. The water level actually went up another few hundred feet above where he painted it. If he had painted the high water mark, all you can see is water. So he lowered the water level so you could see these islands that were within that Lake Lewis. And here's, you can see at the very top of Wallula Gap, on the west side, there's erosional channels that were carved out by the flood. So the floodwaters went up at least this high, up to 1,200 feet in elevation, 1,250. And that would have been in between these two islands here. You have this channel that shows here. And then you can't see this area because it's all underwater. This is all underwater. But you can see there's scabland there. There's basalt bedrock that's been eroded, channelized by these ice age floods. Okay, so we're going to keep moving downstream from here. From the Little Gap, the water took a right turn and headed for the Columbia Gorge. And one of the first places where there's really good evidence for flooding in the gorge is a place called Philippi Canyon. Anybody else in there? Let's see a couple of hands. You can actually drive there. This is I-84. This is looking south. So if anybody who's gone to Portland by the way of the freeway, you've driven right by this and they have not seen it or known what it was. But the maximum flood level was up here, so floodwaters were about 1,000 feet elevation. And when the water was coming down the Columbia Gorge, into the gorge, it encountered this canyon off to the side, and the water kept rising and rising and rising. Eventually it got up to this level and it spilled over into the John Day River Valley. You see the John Day River up here. So some of the water, not all the water, most of the water went down, continued on down the gorge, but some of the water spilled over and it created beautiful scabland up here at the very top. And all that water drained into the John Day River, and then it reconnected with the Columbia a few miles downstream. So this is a beautiful example of a spillover channel for the floods. And then Celilo area, Celilo Park is down here onto the right. And this is 84 again, I-84, Interstate I-84, the Deschutes River up here. So I don't know how many times I drove down here on 84 and looked up and said, oh, there's a wall of basalt. But little did I know until I got a drone and I started driving around up here, I realized it's all scabland, hundreds of feet above the Columbia River. This was all underwater by the floods. You can see how it's channeled out these grooves, these fractures in the rock, similar to what we saw at Blues Falls earlier. So this is scabland, typical classic scabland. And it occurs up here in a few places in the gorge, but the gorge is so narrow in places that it really, you don't see it a lot, but you see it in a few places. And then there's Celilo Falls, which is it's about a couple miles down river from Celilo Park in this area. There's Celilo Falls, and it's underwater from the I think it's the Dalles Dam in that area. Back in the 1950s, they put in the Dalles Dam and flooded the river behind it, including Celilo Falls. But before it was dammed, it looked like this. See, there's a railroad bridge. It's kind of a landmark. And there's all these grooves. This is actually a bathymetry map of underwater. There's people where they're floating in the lake above the falls. They actually bounced radar or sound waves off the bottom of the lake and got a beautiful image of the grooves. These are identical to the grooves we see behind Dry Falls. So we definitely have evidence, similar erosional features and depositional features in the Columbia Gorge as we do up in the scabland. So technically this is scabland, but it's separated by other areas that aren't. Okay, so now we're going down into the Portland Basin. We've gone through the gorge and we're heading west into the Portland area, which is down here. And I want to point out these two very unusual erratics. in the Willamette Valley, okay? When the floods came down, from the gorge, they emptied in to the Portland Basin. Water went north up towards Kalama Gap, and as it did so, Kalama Gap was a narrow opening, so floodwaters, not all the floodwaters going into Kalama Gap could go through at once. So the water backed up, created Lake Allison, which went all the way down to Eugene, Oregon. So this was all underwater, 400 feet deep in the middle of the lake, Lake Allison. And in so doing, it brought down icebergs from the ice dams about the north. And one of those icebergs ended up over here near the little town of Bellevue. So we have what we call the Bellevue erratic. That's a little picture of it here. This is 300 feet above the valley floor. This is the Willamette Valley. Over here, we're looking north. Here's a close-up of the erratic over on the left. This is and it's not your typical granodiorite. It is argillite. And it's identical to the argillites we see elsewhere along the flood path. So we think we can trace that all the way up to northern Idaho. And then there's the Willamette meteorite, which is just south of Portland, in the hills south of Portland. It's a pitted iron nickel, discovered in 1902. There's the weight. And it's the largest meteorite found in the U.S. And it's pitted. It's got these big holes. When they found it, evidently it was mostly buried underground, and just the upper part was sticking out. Yeah, there's a very clay soil, and you know, Portland gets a lot of rain. And the combination of the rain and this thing sitting in clay soil, I think it just disintegrated from weathering. Because I've never seen any other meteorites that have big holes in them like these. So I think it's just dissolution. It's an iron nickel, so it's fairly easily weathered. With lots of water, and it's acidic soil that it was sitting in, I think created the pits that are in there. But I don't know that for sure. That's my hypothesis. But anyway, it was found on the hillside at about 400 feet elevation, which happens to be the high water mark for the floods coming into the Portland Basin. So everything in blue was underwater, and the Willamette meteorite was right at the edge, right at the shoreline for this lake that was in that area. And plus you have, when the floods were coming from the Portland Basin, they were flowing into the Willamette Valley, and as they did so, there's probably some eddy currents going on, because you have this opening here. Water moving down here some of it's going to eddy back into the side channel, and the same thing up here. And this lies in midway in between two eddies. So I think that's a very logical place for the meteorite to end up if it were in an iceberg. And here I think this is Steblinsky did a recreation of what it might have looked like. Okay, well, I'm just about done. I'm going to wrap it up with some shameless commerce. I have a YouTube channel. A lot of the things I showed you tonight, I've taken videos of pictures of, and I've posted videos on YouTube. If you're interested, you're welcome to go there, and you can subscribe. If you want to keep getting any future updates, I have 2 guidebooks I've written. One on the Mid-Columbia. The first one was on the Mid-Columbia Basin, which is where I live, in the Tri-Cities, and it goes up to about as far as the Lower Grand Coulee and down to the Gap. And then the Northern Reaches continues where this one left off, and it goes north up into Grand Coulee and then east all the way to Lake Missoula. So those are guidebooks. self-guiding for anybody who's interested. And then a few years ago, I guess 3 years ago now, I published this book during the pandemic. It was a great project to do during the pandemic. But it's a coffee table type book, mostly pictures, colored pictures, a lot of which I showed you tonight. And that's available. You can get that. I'd order it online. It's actually published in Switzerland, but you can order it through Amazon or you get your own your local bookstore to order it for you from them and get it from them rather than doing it through Amazon. So anyway, it's out there. I didn't bring any to sell tonight because I knew there's going to be a lot of people here and a lot of questions, and I'm going to be tired when this is all over. So, but feel free to, look for that elsewhere. But anyway, this is Ned Wominski. He's the one that provided a lot of the images, the paintings for me, including the Bellevue Erratic and a lot of the others. And this is his painting. And he's showing a Colombian mammoth with flood right behind it. So with that, I think I'm going to stop and I'll ask any questions. Or do we have a microphone then?
Yes. Thank you, Bruce. Great talk and beautiful images. A vote for drones. So we have a microphone. If folks have questions for Bruce, please. We only have about 10 or 12 minutes to be respectful of people's time. If you could keep your question as short as possible. And I'm going to start on this side of the room.
My son was telling me about the gorge that runs up near Sela Gap that has no
Sela
water.
Gap?
Yeah, that big gorge that runs right under the freeway. Is that part of the huge flood, the Missoula
Yeah,
flood?
the floods went all the way up to Sela. That's where they stopped. That's near the elevation. That's near the 1,200 foot elevation. They couldn't go any further because the flood water wasn't going to get it any higher than that. But yeah, they're right up the very end. The back flood that went up the Yakima. Yeah.
I have two questions. First of all, how do you know there were icebergs?
How do I know there are icebergs? Well, there's no other way that we know of to get boulders.
But when you have, the drawings had pictures of icebergs, how do you know that's
and
where
the
they were?
drawings. I picked. Yeah, that was just artistic license. Yeah, I don't know if that was the exact locations.
Secondly,
Yeah, when they're floating in the water, they're all constantly moving.
Yeah.
So, yeah.
and then secondly, around here and where I came from in the Willamette Valley, there are a lot of mountains, a lot of single conical with points. What made those?
It could be volcanoes. There's a lot of it.
But they're still pointed on top. And around here, and they're small, they're not too high in elevation. And they're just...
Yeah. I don't know, it could be just a type of rock, special type of rock that weathers to a point. I don't know. Get your own.
All right. George.
Yes, do you know which flood took out the gorge through the Cascade Mountains?
Say the first part again.
Pardon?
Can you repeat the first part again?
Oh, do you know which flood, glacial flood took out the
Okay,
gorge
what's the gorge
Cascades?
through the Cascades? It was already there. the river had already carved a canyon through the Cascades by the time the flood started. Yeah, yeah, it was already there.
I just have a quick question. How long did it take the outrageous hypothesis to be accepted?
How long did it take for the Bretz's outrageous hypothesis? I would say late 50s, early 60s is about when other geologists started coming around to his idea. But up until then, I mean, he continued to publish until the 30s, 1930s, and he was so criticized, he finally gave up on it, and he became an spelunker. He started caves in the Midwest after that. But then in '56, he published another paper. There was a long hiatus. And in '56, he published his next paper. And that was about the time other people, and he had two other geologists, his co-authors, that were behind him, and they presented, it was mainly in the Grand Coulee area, they presented very convincing evidence. And from then on, I think pretty much all the geologists knew that there was some big events that took place.
So during his lifetime, he was
Yeah, he
indicated.
he died in like 1969, I think. And the year before he died, he was 89 years old, or 90, he was 89 when he died. The year before, he was awarded the Penrose Medal, which is the highest honor you can earn as a geologist for his work. And his only regret is he had outlived all his critics. They were all dead, but and he died a year later. He goes down, he goes higher.
I have a question. So in our region, there also are petrified forests that were found, but those were from back during the lava flows. So all these floods and whatnot was all after that and didn't impact any of those.
Yeah, the earliest floods were about 2 million, and the petrified trees like the ginkgo trees. So those are interbeds of between interbeds of basalt that are about 15 million. So yeah, there was quite a gap there.
Thanks.
Sure.
I think I saw one over here.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, with the scale of these floods, it's hard to imagine, but it's all kind of a result of the Ice Age, right? Are there evidence of similar floods all around the world when the Ice Age was breaking up?
The answer is yes, and we've only known that in the last 10 or 20 years. Other people studying in other parts of the world are starting to discover big floods like these. But so far, none are repeated over and over again on a regular basis that we know of. But there were some really big floods, Siberia, and a few other places. There are been documented big floods with evidence for that.
Thanks. We've got time for about two more.
Two, I believe, geologic terms you were using. The climb, I believe was the word you were using, something climb. And the other one was, you pointed at things and you said, oh, there's a cataract. And I'm like, well, I wasn't sure what you were pointing at or how you identified a cataract, but also I've heard that word climb before, and I don't know what I mean.
Anticline, syncline. Yeah, syncline is a valley that goes like this, and anticline goes like this. Oh. And a cataract is a dry waterfall. It's usually horseshoe shaped or created by floods or water. But sometimes you'll see them in rivers too. They'll be horseshoe shaped, but they're much smaller scale. Like dry falls, it's 3 to 4 miles wide. 2 cataracts, horseshoe-shaped cataracts.
Okay, last one.
Do you know of any, like if there's any books or history, probably oral on if the natives have stories of floods and where to look into that maybe?
Yeah, there are some legends, Native American legends of floods. They're not written down, but they've been passed down orally over generations. And I know there are some people up in Washington, well, we're in Washington. Can't remember their names, but they've been talking with Nick Zender and other people about some of the legends. And the Rattlesnake Mountain, where I did my erratic study, the name for Rattlesnake Mountain is called La Lique by Native Americans. The local, I think it's the Wanapum tribe, call it La Lique, and translated it means land above the water. So, and there's evidence like that. It's not written down anywhere, but it's passed on from generation to generation. Okay, I think we're done.
Thank you, Bruce.